So, what I'll be speaking on today is a chapter that I wrote for a book that my colleague in the history department here at Ohio University and I edited, Settling Ohio, which was published in the spring of 2023 by Ohio University Press. And that's where we can talk about this perhaps a little bit later on, but that's where you can purchase the text. And I'll say a few more words about that later on as well, if you're interested in getting it. As I said, what I'm going to be talking about is chapter 5 from this book that Brian Shane and I co-edited, and that this book resulted from a conference that we held here at Ohio University in the spring of 2020, right before the COVID pandemic. We were able to get it in just before that. And we were really overwhelmed by the response to that conference. And decided to talk to OU Press after that about publishing basically each of the authors writing up what they presented at the conference and then writing that up for a book project. And all but one agreed to do that. And so the 12 chapters in the book are written by the people who presented at that conference. And that conference stemmed from a conference that was held in a couple of years earlier in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And Brian and I both attended that. And that conference occurred at a time right after David McCullough's book, The Pioneers, had just come out. And it was interesting at this academic conference, which was mainly attended by historians, to hear the response to that book. And while many people, including historians, really loved the book because it was very well reviewed. David McCullough is a Pulitzer Prize winning historian. And it's a very readable book, and it tells a great story of the early Anglo-American pioneers from New England who settled at Marietta, Ohio. On the negative side, there's been some critique that it left out a big part of that settlement of Ohio story. And that was that there were lots of other groups that were involved in the early settlement of Ohio, and I should say also the rest of the Old Northwest, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, places like that. And so we got this conference together and got these authors together to kind of address that. And so the book is not a rejoinder to David McCullough's amazing work. Rather, we view it as kind of another part of the story, if you will. And so my contribution to this was to present on research that I've been doing for a long time since I came to Ohio University in 1996, looking at the makeup of the earliest populations in the state. And so I call this Selective Migration and the Evolution of Ohio's Regional Cultural Landscapes, a Genealogical Geography. And I should say, for those of you who are in Indiana and Illinois, many of the historical geographical, and regional patterns that emerged in early Ohio were replicated in Indiana and to some extent Illinois as well. And in terms of kind of a north-south gradient in terms of where people from the East Coast settled. In the northern part of each of those states, the earliest Anglo settlers were made up mainly of people of New England heritage. The central parts of those states is mainly made up of people of Pennsylvanian heritage, especially Pennsylvania German heritage. And the southern parts of those states, anyone who's ever been to southern or southeastern Ohio, southern Indiana, southern Illinois, will tell you right away that those places are Midwestern, yes, but originally those parts of those states was settled mainly by Southerners. In fact, Ohio was really first a southern state. All of the early movers and shakers in Ohio politics were Virginians, and to some extent, people from Kentucky and Tennessee as well. And southern Ohio, or southern Indiana, and southern Illinois also replicate that pattern of mainly early Southerners as the earliest settlers. So I use a couple of different terms here: genealogical geography and selective migration. And I'm so happy to see so many people interested in genealogy here today, because this is a rather new paradigm in American cultural and historical geography, using genealogical family and genealogical data and family histories to help reconstruct past migration patterns. And so I'll talk more about that here in a minute. Another term I'm using is this idea of selective migration. And what I mean by that is the tendency for certain types of people to migrate. That is, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, as the new north, the old Northwest, north and west of the Ohio River was being settled. It was being settled by people from three main areas on the East Coast and on the East Coast, and by early African American populations, and also by European immigrants, mainly Germans. But in the case of, for example, Germans, it wasn't your average everyday German that made it to the United States in the 19th century. Almost all of the research that's been done on, for example, German immigrants shows that that those Germans came from not only specific areas in what's now Germany, but from specific socioeconomic niches, if you will, certain parts of the society. So that's what I mean by selective migration. And I think we can say the same thing when what we'll talk about today when we talk about New Englanders and Pennsylvanians and Virginians moving west. It wasn't your average everyday New Englander. It was people from certain places, as we'll see, and from certain socioeconomic stratum. And I'll make the argument that made all the difference in terms of why landscapes in the Old Northwest look the way they do, and why there's regional differentiation. So selectivity may have been influenced by things like age or education level or socio-demographic characteristics, or biological connections, right? Why a German immigrant from some small town in the middle of nowhere in Northwest Germany makes it to some little town in the middle of nowhere in Indiana, oftentimes had to do with biological connections. They knew someone there, and that's why they went to that specific place. Or maybe age, education level, gender, right? All of these things could maybe influence why a certain person moves and why other people don't. So that's what I mean by selectivity. So that is, migration kind of selected out, if you will, certain people for migration. And then genealogical geography is the use of family histories to analyze and reconstruct previous geographies. And it's predicated on the basic idea that individuals, all of us, all human beings that have ever lived, that now live, that ever will live, are tied together in time and space through their biological connections. We all are. And those family ties can also be a factor in migration selectivity that might influence migration location decisions. So I have here a pretty detailed slide that kind of illustrates what I'm talking about here. And I'll come back to this later on, but this is my kind of take on thinking about and trying to model the settlement of North America by a variety of different population groups from pre-colonial times to the present over time and space. So the way to read this, and I'll put my cursor here, hopefully you can see my cursor. The way to read this is from right to left, with time going from right to left. Whoops, let me go back. And space on this axis kind of up and down this way. So what I mean on this slide by a root place is actually any place. Any town can be a root place. A root place is simply any place that where over generations people have gathered to that place from other places. So pick your town, the town that you are living in right now. That is a root place. So this schematic diagram here is simply meant to represent any place, not any specific place. But for any place, the people who settled in that place over time can trace their lineage back through generations over time and over space back to, well, eventually the old world, right? Unless you are a Native American and an Indigenous American, we're all the product of immigration, right? This is one of the basic facts of American history, is that the population is made up of immigrants and created by a series of immigrations. Going back to the pre-colonial period and continuing to this day. So, so if you read this from right to left, we can also think about it in terms of places. So, for example, going back, say, 4 generations, like if we're reading this today, any given place, going back far enough, we can go back to the old world. So for example, most Americans, if you go back 4 or 5 generations, can trace their ancestry back to the old world. In colonial America, there were 3 or 4 major culture regions that were settled by people from specific regions in the old world. For example, New England was settled primarily by people from East Anglia in this area just to the east and north of London. The area of the Chesapeake Bay, what's now Virginia, Maryland, and Delaware, was settled by people from the south of England. Pennsylvania, the first English people in Pennsylvania came from the North Midlands. People in Appalachia, especially southern Appalachia, stemmed mainly from the British borderlands, mainly Ulster, Northern Ireland, and Western Scotland. And then most people of African descent in the United States can trace their ancestry ultimately back to Senegambia, the region in Western Africa. And then over time, those populations moved out of those old culture hearth regions into other places. And that's what I have here on the bottom here. So I call this during the colonial period, this was what we might call a gathering of migrants from a variety of migration streams from the old world, gathering into what some historians refer to as these colonial hearth regions: New England, the Southeast Pennsylvania, the Chesapeake region, and then Appalachia. And then during the period between about 1790 and 1850, the regions north and west of the Ohio River, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, were settled. I call these secondary settlement regions. So there were these gatherings into places. in the Old Northwest. And then there were subsequent diasporas out of those root places to other places like California, the Great Plains, the Oregon country, places like that. So this is this basic model that my presentation today is predicated on. So let's take a look at Ohio, as Ohio was the first region settled after the settlement of the original 13 colonies and Kentucky and Tennessee. So Ohio was the next state after that, well, after Maine, sorry. So after, and Vermont and New Hampshire, Ohio was the first state in the Old Northwest territory, north and west of the Ohio River. And this occurred beginning around 1790, and this initial population of what's now Ohio lasted until around 1850. This period between 1790 and 1850, most historians refer to as the federal era. Sometimes it's called the early national period. And I want to use the 1850 census as kind of a base to kind of look at and assess what that population looked like at that time, what this early population looked like. Because the 1850 federal census, as many of you who work in genealogy, I'm sure know, was the first census that asked each person enumerated where they were born. And then in 1870, they began asking not only where were you born, but where were your parents born. So if we look at the 1850 census, that gives us an idea, a pretty good idea of where that population was coming from. And if we look at the 1850 census for Ohio, it's clear that there were three main groups of populations. One was what I call, for lack of a better term, Anglo-Americans, right? So these would be people of mainly British or sort of British Islander ancestry, who had been in North America for at least a couple and sometimes 3 generations, right? Who saw themselves as having Anglo ancestry, but didn't see themselves any longer as really British, but rather that something new, right, that is beginning to form about 1790, and that right after the Revolution, and that is this idea of calling oneself an American. So that's what I mean by Anglo-American. And if you kind of parse out these numbers in the 1850 census and look at them in more detail, it's clear that those Anglo-Americans came from 3 of the primary East Coast colonial settlement areas. New England, and it turns out for Ohio and to some extent Indiana, this was mainly from Connecticut, as we'll see. A second source was the Mid-Atlantic, and for all intents and purposes, that was Pennsylvania, especially southeastern Pennsylvania. And the South, and what I mean by the South is the original South, right? Not the deep South, but the original South, which of course was the Chesapeake Bay region, Virginia, Maryland, and to a lesser extent Delaware, but especially Virginia. After all, the capital of the Confederacy was Richmond, Virginia, right? So Virginia was the first South. So that's one group. A second group that appears in the census is African Americans and members of what I call multi-ethnic groups, who were coming mainly from the upland South, and that means Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and what's now West Virginia. Many of these folks, as subsequent studies have shown, were members of for lack of a better term, multi-ethnic or multicultural groups. These are people who didn't have wholly African-American ancestry, but had actually ancestry that was part African, partly Anglo or British, and partly Indigenous Native American. I'll talk more about this later on, but it turns out a lot of these early African Americans who are settling in antebellum Ohio and Indiana and Illinois are members of these mixed groups. And then a third group that shows up in the 1850 census is foreign immigrants. So these are new immigrants, right? Not the original immigrants who were settling during the colonial period, but a new group of immigrants who are coming mainly from Northern and Western Europe, beginning around the 1820s. And most of those were numerically from German-speaking Europe. I don't use the term Germany here because at the time there was no such thing as Germany, right? There was no such thing as Germany until 1871, 1872. So German-speaking Europe, but mainly from what is now northern and western Germany. Here's those numbers sort of aggregated. So this is nativity, so place of birth in 1850. So what's amazing about this this slide here to me is that if you look down at the bottom, the population of Ohio in 1850 was already just under 2 million people, which is really amazing because in 1790, 1800 or so, there couldn't have been more than 10,000 people of Anglo-British ancestry living in what's now Ohio. But already 50 years later, there are almost 2 million, and of those 2 million, 1.3 million, or 66% of the population, had already been born in Ohio. So that tells you something about the birth rates during this time. They were very high fertility rates, right? The fertility rates, the average number of children born to the average woman was probably upwards of around 4.5 or 5. So very large families and high birth rates. Of the people not born in Ohio, here we can see these three main areas, right? Pennsylvanians and other people from mid-Atlantic, right? So of that 1.98 million, about 9.6% were born in Pennsylvania, 16.5% overall born in the mid-Atlantic. About 5.2% were born in the colonial South, especially Virginia. About just under 3% came from New England, especially Connecticut. And then you see foreign immigrants, about 146,000. That was 7.4% of the population. And the Black population, about 25,000, although this is most certainly an undercount. If you look in the federal manuscript population schedules, oftentimes you will see beside a person an M that stood for mulatto. So, and in fact, most of the quote-unquote Black population in Ohio in 1850 were probably mulatto. The census takers use this term mulatto, which is now a term that's no longer used. But what they meant was a person of mixed ancestry. If you look at the foreign born, it was overwhelmingly from two places: Germany, quote unquote, right? The German-speaking Europe, and Ireland. Over half of the foreign immigrants, it's about 60% of the foreign immigrants came from just those two places. So let me begin with this map. I think this is one of the most important maps. This shows the United States in about 1790 or so, 1800, something like that. And what it shows is the United States right after the end of the Revolutionary War and the Treaty of Paris, which ended the Revolutionary War. In the Treaty of Paris, the United States gained most of this territory that's in green on this map, light green. That is mainly between the Appalachians on the east and the Mississippi River on the west. And literally overnight, the United States became one of the geographically largest countries in the world. This area, however, was occupied by a variety of different population groups. There were certainly Anglo-Americans living in here. There were people of French ancestry who had come down via the Great Lakes and via the Mississippi and its tributaries all the way down to New Orleans. And of course, there were lots and lots of indigenous groups speaking dozens and dozens of different languages in dozens and dozens of different culture ethnic groups who claimed different parts of this territory. As you see on this map, this territory was also claimed by eastern states. This, for example, shows over here the boundaries of Massachusetts and Connecticut. The western boundary of Massachusetts and Connecticut legally was the Pacific Ocean at this point. And that stemmed from the royal charters that established the colonies. So the colony of Massachusetts and the colony of Connecticut were defined by their north and south borders, and those were latitude lines. And on those 17th century charters, the western boundaries, the wording says something like the Great Ocean of the West. And what is meant by that is the Pacific. So legally, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Virginia, New York, North Carolina, Georgia, the western borders was the Pacific Ocean. So the new federal government had a lot on its hands in terms of its new geography that it had to figure out and deal with, and how it dealt with these issues, these three main issues. One is, what do we do about the dozens and dozens of indigenous groups and made up of thousands and thousands of people? What do we do about their claims to this land as ethnic homelands? Number two, what do we do about this problem, about these East Coast states claiming land out here that has just been won in the Revolutionary War? And then a third problem is, how do we get people out here on the East Coast to settle out here toward the middle of the new country? Because of course the federal government from the very beginning saw all of this land as a way to replenish the treasury. Remember, the United States, the new United States, was flat broke. In fact, it was heavily in debt, not only to foreign countries like France, but also in debt to the various individual states. So this is a problem that the federal government needs to deal with. And in fact, the first two Congresses spend the majority of their time, and many of the laws that were passed by the first two Congresses had to do with these issues, with these problems. So the history of how the United States solved that first problem, which was, what do we do with the indigenous populations that claim the interior, portions of the interior, as ethnic homelands, is of course a sad and violent history. I'm not going to go into that history in detail. There are a couple of chapters in the book Settling Ohio that do go into this in detail. This indigenous history isn't my forte. I know a little bit about it, but if you want to know more in detail about it, there are other authors. I'd be happy to let anyone know about those sources. This painting is the cover that we chose for Settling Ohio, and I was able to, I got to choose the cover, and I remember seeing this image in the Chicago History Museum. It's a painting that is really only about maybe 2 feet by 2 feet in size. It's not very big. And it's kind of a nondescript painting hanging on a nondescript wall in the Chicago History Museum. And I was there in, I think, 2018 or so, and I remembered seeing this picture and thinking, what is this, right? It didn't even have an official title. The unofficial title is Negotiations for the Treaty of Greenville. We don't even know who the artist was. We know it was painted around May of 1785. And what it shows here is something extraordinary that was going on in places like Ohio and then later on Indiana and Illinois during the early national period. And that is these negotiations taking place between various indigenous population groups and the new federal government. And this is a part of that history that I think is just unbelievably now in the early 21st century being really retold. And that is this back and forth that's going on, these negotiations that are going on between indigenous groups and the federal government. And who we see here are some really interesting figures. We see William Henry Harrison. This is the future president, William Henry Harrison. Remember Tippecanoe and Tyler too, right? That's the saying from their, what they were using when they were campaigning, right? Their campaign slogan. And here we have Harrison, and next to him is General Anthony Wayne, the so-called Mad Anthony Wayne. And then we see Little Turtle, the Miami chief, and Tarahe, the Crane, the Wyandotte chief. And there were probably representatives from dozens of other tribes that were on hand as well. We don't know exactly where this painting was from, but I think this is from somewhere in the Middle Scioto Valley in what's now South Central Ohio, probably somewhere around Chillicothe, Ohio, which is about 50 miles south of Columbus. That's where the Shawnee had their principal village, Chillicothe, and it probably took place there. And they are negotiating what's going to happen out here in the Old Northwest in terms of land and claims to land. Another interesting figure on this painting is this guy right here on one knee who's writing. This is Captain William Wells. And what this shows is something extraordinary, and that is that this is in 1785, and this is a person who is translating. He is writing down what's being said between Little Turtle and the army group here. And that means that he knows Miami. He's fluent in Miami and English. This makes sense because what we know about William Wells is that he was taken captive in Kentucky by the Miami and was taken to what's now Western Ohio in the late 1770s, early 1780s, and basically lived among them as a young man and eventually married Little Turtle's daughter. So William Wells is Little Turtle's son-in-law. And so we see this in this scene here, this extraordinary circumstance that's taking place. A few months later, the more famous painting that many people know is this. The Treaty of Greenville took place in August 3rd of 1795. And here we see the Shawnee chief, Tecumseh, surrendering and ceding land to Anthony Wayne again. And so what happened in that Treaty of Greenville is that on this map here that I'm highlighting with my cursor, this is that Greenville Treaty line. So in essence, what happened here is the federal government negotiated with the different tribes that claimed ethnic homelands in this part of the country for them to cede their lands south of this line to the federal government. So there's no other state in the country that has a map like this. Well, maybe with the exception of Texas, because Texas also was settled by right? The Spanish, the French, then the Mexicans, then the Texans, and then finally the United States, right? So it also has a map that has lots of different land subdivisions. But Ohio, really, there's no other state except for Texas that has a map that looks like this. So this line basically, by August of 1795, the Native American groups were pushed to the north and west, and then through subsequent treaties were pushed out of Ohio completely. First to places like Illinois and Nebraska and Kansas, and then finally to Indian Territory in what's now Oklahoma by probably the 1840s, 1850s or so. So that was the federal government's solution to this first problem, what to do about Native Americans. And sadly, the answer to that, the solution to that problem was a rather violent solution that one could argue is still kind of taking place. And that was, in the new Constitution of the United States, there was simply no legal way for a country to exist within a country. In other words, there could not be a sovereign country for the Shawnee, for example, within the United States. And if you think about it, that's one of the reasons, why the Civil War happened, because a group of states seceded and wanted to form their own country. And of course, the federal government's answer to that was, no, that is illegal. That cannot be done. And a civil war was fought over it. So this was the solution was simply to repatriate indigenous populations with land. And Americans saw that as the next best thing to giving them money, if you will, because land was seen by Americans as a commodity, of course, to be bought and sold. Okay, so that's the solution to the first problem. The solution to the second problem, what do we do with these? Let me go back here for a slide. What do we do with this issue of states claiming land in the interior? Was worked out in the first Congress. And to make a very long story short, all of these eastern states who claimed land in the West agreed to cede their claims to the federal government in exchange for the cancellation of Revolutionary War debt. And so when that happened, the federal government then came into possession of all of this land. After that happened, the federal government then opened up these lands in the so-called Old Northwest, beginning with what's now Ohio, to Anglo-American settlement. If you look at that 1850 census and map out where people from these main areas on the East Coast were going, it doesn't take a geographer to see here on this map that people didn't just go kind of willy-nilly scattered out into the wilderness, out into the Old Northwest, but rather there were certain streams from certain places in the East Coast that linked up the East Coast with the Old Northwest. So what I've done on this map is each of these little units is a civil township. The darker lines are counties, but the individual little squares are civil townships. And so what I did here is I simply looked at the people not born in Ohio in 1850, and I simply colored in where the majority were from. If 50.1% or more of the non-Ohio born population was born in New England, I colored it red. Pennsylvania, yellow, the upland South, blue. And you see this pattern. And this pattern is replicated in Indiana and also in Illinois. That is, the northern part of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois was settled primarily early on by Yankees from New England. The central parts of those states were settled mainly by Pennsylvanians. And in the case of Ohio, most of those were people of Pennsylvania German or Pennsylvania Dutch ancestry. And the southern parts of those states, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, was settled mainly by people from the upland South, and that's mainly Virginia. And so, as a geographer, I'm really interested in the landscape, the cultural landscape. What did people do when they got to these places? And how did this New England parentage, this Pennsylvania parentage, this upland South parentage, how did that affect what the landscape looks like, especially in terms of the material culture? And so the rest of my presentation focuses on that, on these three main groups, Anglo-Americans, African-Americans, and foreign immigrants, mainly Germans. So let's start with upland Southerners. They were some of the very first to come into the Old Northwest, north and west of the Ohio River. So another interesting pattern that we see in Ohio that we don't see replicated in other places like Indiana and Illinois is that in what's now Ohio, both Connecticut and Virginia reserved some of this land in the West. So Connecticut and Virginia both had very strong congressional representation in the first Congress, and they were able to cut a deal with the federal government. For example, Connecticut said, we will cede all of our claims to land all the way to the Pacific Ocean, but we're going to reserve a chunk of land in what's now Ohio, north of this latitude line, east of this longitude line, and we're going to reserve that to repatriate Revolutionary War veterans from New England, or especially from Connecticut. Especially those who lost property or who served in the Connecticut militia during the Revolutionary War. So Connecticut didn't have any money to pay its Revolutionary War veterans, but it had lots of land. And land, of course, in the 19th century was the key to wealth. Virginia did the same thing. Virginia was able to negotiate a deal with the federal government. We'll cede our claim to all of this land in the West, but we're going to reserve a piece of land in between the Scioto River and the Little Miami River. And that became known as the Virginia Military District, because Virginia wanted to do the same thing here. It wanted to repatriate, pay in kind with land, its Revolutionary War veterans. So it's clear that that had an effect on kind of directing migrants. Where did Yankee migrants go in Ohio when they settled during the early national period? They went mainly to Northeast Ohio. Where did Virginians go? Mainly to Southern Ohio. And Pennsylvanians kind of filled in the middle area. So, the 1850 census can tell us a lot in terms of let me go back, working out these types of patterns, these kind of very broad patterns. But, it doesn't, because the 1850 census only asked each person enumerated, where were you born? What state or what foreign country were you born in? If we want to know more exactly where people came from in a specific place, well, that's where I think genealogy has a big role to play. And so, genealogists have been doing this work for a long, long time, but it's only relatively recently that academics, especially historians, have begun to kind of see the value in that academically. And geographers have been picking up this as well, and have kind of coined this term genealogical geography to use family biologies to reconstruct past migration patterns. And that's what I've done here in general for four prominent families who settled in the Chillicothe, Ohio area in beginning around 1796 or so. And I just picked these families, but kind of at random. But I think if you look at almost all of the families that settled early on in that part of southern Ohio, you'll see similar types of patterns. So what I think is, if you map out this kind of intergenerational past geographies of these families, what you see here are a series of gatherings and then diasporas. So the initial gathering was from mainly, in this case, Northern Ireland, Ulster, and the Netherlands and England. So in the case of the Van Meter family, they came in the 1680s, early 1680s, from Gelderland, which is a province in southern Holland, the Netherlands. And they settled in the Hudson Valley like many other Dutch families did in the colonial period, right? Families like the Roosevelts and the Van Burens and those famous intergenerational families with intergenerational wealth, right? Who went on to become presidents, right? The Van Burens, the Roosevelts, families like that. And then we had this gathering of people from England and from Northern Ireland in southeast Pennsylvania, mainly around Philadelphia and just to the north and west. So here's this first gathering to this area in the colonial period. And then there's a subsequent diaspora, as we see with these four families, to a very specific place. And this is Hardy County, Virginia. And then in 1863, it became Hardy County, West Virginia, of course. And so that's a new root place, if you remember that slide from earlier. So here's another root place made up of a gathering of these families who knew each other from this area. If we look at their genealogies, they intermarried. All of these four families all knew each other very well. They intermarried with each other, and they also moved with each other in the 1750s and 60s, some as early as the 1730s, down into this area. By the 1790s, there was a subsequent diaspora to a new root place, this time in the Scioto Valley of Ohio, beginning around 1800 or so. So here we see on this map this series of gatherings and diasporas. Gatherings and diaspora, a new gathering. And then if we took this into subsequent generations, we would see a subsequent diaspora out of this area to places further west, maybe even as far as California. So this area of gathering in the 1750s, 1760s was this area just to the west of the Blue Ridge. That's Great North Mountain on this map. That's the Blue Ridge. So the Shenandoah Valley is right in here. And this is an area that came to be settled by these prominent families, these four prominent families, the Van Meters, the McNeils, the Cunninghams, and a variety of other families. And they come to be very wealthy, kind of planter elite families living in these big mansions. And they were slave owners. They weren't large slave owners. They had maybe a dozen, some of these, like the Van Meter family, had about a dozen slaves, because they weren't growing cash crops. Rather, they were cattlemen. And in this area in the south branch of the Potomac River Valley, centered on Moorfield, these families come to invent a new kind of animal husbandry focused on cattle that really, I argue, is the antecedent of the stalker feeder industry that emerges in the Corn Belt later in the American Midwest. And that system is basically during the summer, letting your cattle roam up here in the highlands, and then in the winter, bringing them down into pens, putting them in pens and feeding them corn that they're growing in the valley here. And then the following spring, driving them on foot to market. And in this case, the markets were back east, Boston, Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, places like that. And so these families become quite wealthy doing this. But they're also very large families, and this is not a very large area, so they run out of land. Well, where is there more land? In 1790, there's more land further to the west as Ohio is opening up, and some of these families are the first settlers in the Chillicothe area, which in fact that was the first capital of Ohio. And a lot of these Southerners were the early movers and shakers in Ohio politics. So here is a landscape that emerges here, is basically an upland southern landscape. And if you go to this part of Ohio, and I should say also if you go to southern Indiana, southern Illinois, you'll see a similar type of cultural landscape. And that is basically a southern cultural landscape that gets transplanted into this area with these large mansions, what are known as eye houses, and southern types of barns. So eye houses are what looked like this. This was the most popular form of housing in the colonial America. And this is the Van Meter farm, just south of Chillicothe, Ohio. There's another better view of what an eye house is, right? It's basically one room deep, 2 or more rooms wide with a central stairway. The Virginians in Ohio, at least, used a meets and bounds survey system rather than what was later known as the Township Range Rectilinear Survey. So a lot of the early surveys look like this. And if you fly over that part of Ohio, this is what it looks like, right? So it doesn't look like the rest of the Midwest, which is squares. It's these meets and bounds surveys. In the central part of the state, here in the yellow, Pennsylvania Germans were the primary settlers. And if you look at the settlement of individual families, you see a similar type of gathering in the colonial period into southeast Pennsylvania, and then a subsequent diaspora to this part of Ohio, which was just north and west of this glacial divide, in an area that had very, very good soils, which made sense for these Pennsylvanians because these were mainly farmers who had a extensive commercialized agricultural system focused not only on crops, but also on animals, especially dairy cattle. You can also look at county histories to kind of see where people were born. It was very common in the American Midwest to see county histories being published in the 1870s, 1880s. And those county histories often contain biographies of early, what are often called prominent citizens. And these were mainly, of course, male landowners. But if you look at the one for Fairfield County, Ohio, which was the county seat was Lancaster, you can see where those families, prominent families, were coming from. And it was mainly southeast Pennsylvania, this area and this area and that area. And they brought with them different types of building. For example, they built barns that were much, much larger than Southern or New England barns because they needed a barn to not only store hay and grain, but also to protect their dairy cattle. And so they built barns that are known as bank barns. And this area in Ohio centered on Lancaster, has the largest distribution of these types of barns outside of Pennsylvania. This is this area where these folks settled, just north and west of this glacial divide in Ohio. I'm standing here on top of the Wisconsin glacial moraine, right? It's looking to the north and west. So this is where the Midwest begins, right? Back behind me is Appalachia. In front of me is the Till Plains, right? The Middle West. And these are these types of barns that were built by the Pennsylvania Germans, so-called bank barns, because they were banked in the side of a hill with 2 stories, an upper story containing hay mows and grain bins, cribs, and then in the bottom you'd have cattle stanchions for your dairy cattle. Here's a map showing the distribution of those types of barns. You find them throughout Ohio and Indiana and Illinois, but the densest distributions are in southeast Pennsylvania and in Ohio. Here's another example of one built in 1819. Notice this motif here, this sun swirl motif, this ancient Germanic motif that shows up here in the middle of Ohio in 1820. Really interesting. Here's another good example. This is a log, a crib bank barn, probably built around 1820 in Perry County, just northeast of Lancaster. The Pennsylvania Germans also built eye houses. That was the most common popular form, especially for people who had some money during this period. So the Pennsylvania Germans did not build Germanic houses. They built English style houses that looked like this. And they put these decorative elements, that's called federal, on them. Most of these folks were Lutherans and members of German Reformed denominations. Some of them were Amish and Mennonite, but only about 10%. Most of the Pennsylvania Dutch were, in fact, Lutherans. And throughout this area of Ohio, you find in the rural landscape these really gorgeous white churches, usually associated with a cemetery. And in those cemeteries, you can find some really interesting features. Here's the stone of Wilhelm Betzer. And here's Henry Roller. And again, you see that Germanic sun swirl that shows up. Really quite interesting. In this part of Ohio, the Pennsylvania Germans, well, first the federal government surveyed this out into the township range rectilinear public survey system. And the Pennsylvania Germans laid out towns on a grid pattern, but they also brought from Southeast Pennsylvania a very specific way of laying out county seats, and sometimes other towns as well. And that is by putting the county courthouse in the middle of a square, but taking the square out of 4 adjacent blocks, such that you had kind of an offset square. This is what's known as a Philadelphia or a Pennsylvania square. This one is from Mount Vernon, Ohio. And you can see the antecedent to this is Philadelphia. This is the 1683 map drawn by the early progenitor of Pennsylvania. And you can see that middle square there. And today, if you go to Philadelphia, Philadelphia City Hall is right in the middle of that square. Here's another example, and this is from this little town of Somerset, just northeast of Lancaster in Ohio. And this is what that square looks like today. This was originally the county courthouse before it was moved to another courthouse. Now it's just the City Hall, I believe. New Englanders settled mainly in Northeast Ohio. And if you look at these genealogies of families, again, you see this initial gathering during the colonial period, and then a subsequent diaspora to Northeast Ohio, and then subsequent diasporas further west to places like Michigan and Northern Illinois and Indiana and Wisconsin and Minnesota as well. Many of the people in the earliest Connecticut settlers in Ohio came from this area of Northwest Connecticut, known as Litchfield County, and from around in and around Litchfield Village. And those folks brought with them other ways of building. For example, they built these very large, what's known as a New England large house. Those with more modest means built what's known as an upright and wing house, or salt box houses like you see here. And most of these folks were members of the United Church of Christ. That's the old Congregational Church. And so these big UCC churches emerged as well. So you see those in places like Talmadge. Here's the first United Church of Christ, built in 1807, and that is right on the village green. And in the village cemetery, you see sometimes some of these really interesting New England forms. This winged effigy here, there with the eye of God and the scroll. Those are motifs that show up oftentimes. They settled in towns and villages, and those villages often were set on a so-called green and open area. And in northeastern Ohio, there are several dozen of these green villages. The Connecticut Land Company, who took control of the settlement of this part of the state, divided their land into rectilinear townships, but they're different from the federal township and range system. They're 25 square mile townships instead of 36 square mile townships. But Talmadge is a really good example of this kind of New England settlement pattern of roads radiating out in these cardinal directions and in northeast to southwest directions around a central village on a central green. And that's what you see here at Talmadge. And at Milan, further to the west, here's the central green. A second group was African Americans and members of multi-ethnic populations. Most of those folks were coming from what's now Virginia and West Virginia, and were moving into southern Ohio and to some extent southern Indiana and southern Illinois as well. In Ohio, there were 3 or 4 main areas that emerged as areas for settlement of these 19th century Black populations. So again, this is before the Civil War. Look at the dates here, as early as 1819. Many of these people in these 3 settlements right here, the Gist settlement and the Blackfort settlement, were manumitted slaves who had been manumitted from slavery on plantations in Virginia, and were given land by their former slave owners in Ohio. It's a really highly fascinating history. This area in northeast Athens County in Ohio was settled originally by a group of people who came from what's now West Virginia, Barber County, West Virginia, around the town of Philippi. Many of the people in that part of Ohio can trace their ancestry back to this area. So what does that landscape look like? Well, it's primarily a religious landscape with distinctive religious Protestant denominations, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, Baptist churches, and especially churches of God, right? So these are Pentecostal holiness churches that you find in these areas. Cemeteries with distinctive folk art and sometimes distinctive folk architecture. And then also heritage and memorial landscapes, like Underground Railroad house sites, historical markers, and such. So this is this area in northeast Athens County, Ohio, that was settled in the 1830s by this man, Michael Tabler, and his wife, Hannah. Hannah was a slave an enslaved person on Michael's father's plantation just outside of Richmond, Virginia. Michael fell in love with one of his father's enslaved persons, Hannah, and married her, had 2 children with her in Virginia, but that was illegal, of course, at the time. And so he found himself forced to leave. He first moved to Wheeling, and then he bought the freedom of his wife and his 2 children, and they looked for land in Ohio and found it in this part of Northeast, what's now Northeast Ohio County. Many of the descendants of this little town can trace their ancestry back to this union of Michael Tabler and Hannah. Here's Michael's grave in the little cemetery there. And you see in these cemeteries, sometimes these homemade graves like that of rural Goins here. Here you see another example of that. This is in the Carmel settlement in Highland County, Ohio. All that's left of that settlement today is this cabin here and the cemetery that's next to it, again with these kind of homemade gravestones. Sometimes you'll see historical markers like the Gist settlement. This is also in Highland County, Ohio. This is some archaeologists have been doing work on this area. There's really not a town there anymore. There's just kind of the remains of cabins, and they've been doing some work. This is the cabin of James Turner, who came as a young man when he was about 15 to Ohio. Then you'll see things like genealogical societies. This is the Multicultural Heritage and Genealogical Society in Chester Hill, Ohio. And so these are folks who do a lot of research on this really interesting genealogy. And if you're interested in this, there have been some recent books written about these early African-American communities in the Midwest. The earliest one from 1999 was this book by Stephen Vincent. One of the more recent ones is this book by Annalisa Cox, The Bone and Sinew of the Land. This is mainly about early African-American settlements in Indiana. She talks some about Illinois and Ohio, but it's mainly Indiana. And she found at least 300 of these pre-Civil War Black settlements of Black farmers in the Midwest. And this is a history that is really just now being told by historians. And I know I'm going long here, so I'll just finish up real quickly with this final group, and that's new immigrants that are coming into Ohio and also Indiana and Illinois, mainly from German-speaking Europe. So on this map here, in the green townships, these are places where more than 50% of the population was foreign-born, and in each of these cases, the majority were German. So I'm going to focus on this area in far western Ohio, near the Indiana border, right here. This whole area from Cincinnati up to Toledo, there are a series of German towns and townships where German immigrants settled in between the 1830s and the 1870s or so. And I'll focus on this one in Mercer and Auglaize counties. The Germans tended to settle among each other. These are this is the 1850 census for Auglaize County, Ohio, and looking at the foreign-born, and you can see that where did the German settlers, immigrants settle? Mainly in German township, right? In this one township. So they settle among each other. And if you map out their genealogy, their kind of life path map, like I did with the others, you get a map like this. And what's missing on this map compared to the other ones, of course, is these arrows. And that's because these folks were coming they were coming from Germany directly to Ohio. They weren't coming via East Coast. They, of course, came ashore in Baltimore, was the main port at that time, but they went immediately out to these rural areas of Ohio, beginning in the early 1830s. And they came from a very specific part of Germany in this case. And I knew this when I first encountered this population and I saw these names: Flederjohn, Katerheinrich, Kuchhermann, Herkenhoff, right? These are not, Schmitz and Mullers, and these are very distinctive names. And it turns out those names occur even today in Germany, only in this one small part of Germany, in far northwestern Germany, north and west of Münster, which is about right in here. And it turns out that over about a 50-year period, this little town of Ladbergen basically relocated to western Ohio, to Auglaize and Mercer counties, Ohio. And this is this area I'm talking about, centered on these three towns of New Knoxville, New Bremen, and Minster. Originally, these settlers were in Cincinnati, but as the Ohio Erie Canal was being constructed through this area, they got together their funds and they purchased land in this area from the federal government and established these three towns. What's really interesting about this German immigrant area is each of these towns was established by three different denominations: by Catholics in the case of Minster, German Reformed in the case of New Bremen, and non-denominational types of Protestant denominations in New Knoxville. So three different towns settled by people from basically the same region, but they established three different towns to account for the different confessions of the different settlers. So what do you see there? What are those cultural landscapes? Well, it's mainly a religious cultural landscape. Roman Catholic, large Roman Catholic churches, convents, monasteries, and chapels, and also distinctive place names and surnames. So here's Minster, right, with this big, huge double steepled church, right? Whenever you see a landscape like that anywhere in the rural Midwest, it's a 10-to-1 that town was settled by Catholics, and more often than not by German Catholics. This is the little town of New Knoxville. Most of these folks were German Reformed. Here you see these really distinctive names: Katerheinrich. That originally was Kutter, K-O with an umlaut, Katerheinrich. Heinrich is Henry. Ketter or Kutter means a cottager or a peasant. So many peasants at that time took the name of their landlord that they worked for. So this was Henry's peasant, Henry's cottager. And so really distinctive names you see on the landscape there. You see out in the middle of cornfields, these large seminaries. This is the St. Charles Cemetery near Cartagena in Mercer County. There's a reliquary and a relic chapel, right? So underneath the nave of this church at Mariastein is a relic chapel, right, with relics of the saints, supposedly, encased behind glass. So some really interesting landscapes. I will leave it there, and I know I went kind of long. I apologize that, but I will be happy to answer questions. And of course, you can all, any of you are more than welcome to send me an email, which is, I've got an email on the first slide there. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you all for listening. I apologize for going a little longer than I thought it was going to go, but I hope I didn't didn't go too long.
Thank you. No, that was very interesting. And there's been a lot of questions, so I've been trying to answer them as I could,
Okay.
just to kind of alleviate some of the time. But there were a few things that I can't answer. So one is asking, are you familiar with the works of Dr. Laurel Porter, who was a longtime instructor at Muskegon?
Yes, I do know. I know her. I've met her. In fact, I've been reading some of her stuff just lately as well. Yes, so I do know her stuff. Yep.
Perfect. Wonderful. And then there were a couple questions that I think could be easily answered. And I sent a response, but I wanted everyone to hear. Um, they were asking about the similarities of migration and settlement to Ohio to Indiana.
Yeah. Yeah, so very similar types of patterns. Um, uh, the migration of New Englanders, of Pennsylvanians, and Virginians was rather latitudinal, kind of east to west. Um, and so the northern part of Indiana is was settled largely, at least in that early settlement period, by New Englanders, by Yankees. The middle part by Pennsylvanians, and a lot of German immigrants. Lots of German immigrants, right? And then the southern part of Indiana, a lot of Virginians, right? And to this day, if you go to southern Indiana, it looks and feels and tastes and smells a lot like the upland south. If you go to kind of the central part of Indiana, it feels very Midwestern. And you go to the northern part of Ohio, there are places where it feels very Yankee. And one good place to look is on maps and look at place names, and town names and things like that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and end the questions. If you didn't get your question answered, feel free to reach out. You have Dr. Anderson's email address on the screen, but also he has generously agreed to send us the PowerPoint, and we will email that out to anyone who requests it. All you need to do is email us at genealogy@acpl.info. I will tell you, we are getting a lot of thank yous, and people are very pleased with the presentation. So thank you so much for coming on and letting us know a little bit about the book. But also, can you tell us where can we find this book? How can people purchase it?
Sure. Yeah, you can get it on Ohio University Press. So you can just Google Ohio University Press, and you can buy it directly through OU Press. You can also buy it on Amazon. I think for the
Perfect.
same price. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Everyone, if you enjoyed this, you might enjoy the book. So always good to look for it. But thank you again for giving us a wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone who joined us today, and hope to see you all on Thursday. Have a good day. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all. Thanks, everyone.